Here we go. Okay, so now we are live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. If you guys just tuned in, if you could do me a huge favor and just type something in the comments to see if you can hear me loud and clear, that would be fantastic. So let's get into it. This is another weekly feedback Q&A. Every Sunday, guys, 2:30 GMT, 9:30 EST time. My name is Raf, and I'm the feedback coach and a podcast host. My podcast is called Coaching Leaders, and I work with managers and teams, helping them develop this healthy, engaging, and thriving feedback culture. Today, guys, today's topic is receiving feedback well. Let me just click things here. So today, it's going to be all about receiving feedback. Oh, I just noticed it overlays with my, not ideal. I need to just disable it, hide it. Okay, so guys, it's all about receiving feedback well. And as we go through the sessions, if you do have any questions around feedback conversation, not necessarily only about receiving feedback well, please share them, type them, and I'll do my very best to answer them. Perhaps right now, one of your goals is to think about what you should work on with your personal development. Perhaps you're in a position where you got to decide which skill sets you are going to work on and develop. Or maybe you're thinking, how can I improve a feedback culture within my organization? Today, I will try to present to you and convince you that it's a really good idea to double down on receiving feedback skills. And there are a few reasons for that. Mastering that skill, getting really good at receiving feedback well, will have significant influence and impact on your professional career. That's the most obvious part. It will have really strong influence over your emotional well-being, over our emotional well-being. And thirdly, that particular skill has also significant impact on the relationship with people around us. So let me break it down for you. Let's start with the career. I am not entirely sure which organization you're working right now and what's your position, but I'm certain that the amount of feedback that you're receiving fluctuates. Sometimes there is more of it, sometimes there is less of it. Typically, we're not receiving as much feedback as we would hope to get in order to grow and develop ourselves. And especially the higher you go, the lesser the feedback is. And so when feedback is coming our way, it's really important to extract the value from it. See, just because the feedback wasn't delivered well, or we perceiving it as the one that wasn't delivered well, it doesn't mean that there is no value within that feedback. It means that the value is hidden behind our emotional response to it, and our responsibility is to dig a little bit deeper and to go through that emotional response of our own and extract that value, find it and extract it. And secondly, each feedback that is being shared with you, especially from your peers and from your team, if you respond well to it, then there will be more feedback coming your way in the future, because it's not comfortable to share feedback with you. Even from your managers, it's not as comfortable to share that challenging feedback with you, because we tend to be really consumed with how the other person would respond. And so if you take that away from the equation and you position yourself as a person who's really receiving well every single piece of feedback that's coming your way, then your peers, your managers will share more feedback with you. Therefore, you grow more and your career will take a nice uptick. The second reason why it's so important to work on receiving feedback skills is because our well-being. First and foremost, think about the examples when you receive the feedback, whether it's from your peers, from your team, from your manager, and it's during the conversation and you've over-responded to it, overreacted to it. Think about what does it cause to your stress level, to how you feel throughout the day, and what impact does it have to the rest of your day. So the better you get at receiving feedback, of course, there will be less stressful circumstances in your life. But there's also more to it. Your mindset is really important here. How you develop your mindset will be influenced how you receive feedback, because the tactics and the tools are very similar with receiving the feedback and how you develop your own mindset and the sense of self-esteem as well. Right? So when you're receiving the feedback and you're not reading it well, you're not receiving it well, it has a knock-on effect on your confidence and self-esteem. And secondly, when you are working on anything, and if you have delivered a certain project or anything for that matter, and you're not really satisfied with how it went, the story that we are telling ourselves has significant impact on our perception of ourselves, self-esteem, which then has a knock-on effect on everything else. And it really goes down to how you perceive that situation, how you extract the value from it, and how you understand the situation that you've been through. Very similar like with you engaging in feedback conversation. And the third reason is the relationship, your relationship with your team, your relationship with your managers, your superiors, but also with your partners and kids and your friends is really influenced by your ability to receive feedback well. Because it's not only the times when the feedback is being shared with you, but also when you are engaging in conversation and the opinions are different, or you are brainstorming with your team and you are going through different problems, different ideas, and you disagree with certain points and certain inputs, the way you understand what your team is presenting to you, or the way you perceive someone else's point of view or opinion, is very much the same as you would receive a negative feedback. Meaning, if you respond to the feedback and you disagree with someone else's opinion strongly, the mechanism here is very similar. What's happening in our mind and our head, the story that we're telling ourselves, is very much similar. So by improving how you're receiving feedback well, you are going to improve how you are engaging in heated conversations, how you are perceiving other people's point of views. So career, your well-being, and your relationship with others, those are the three things that are heavily influenced by the ability to receive feedback well. So let's just get into how can we start getting better at receiving feedback well. The ultimate goal here, as always, with receiving feedback well. So if you look at the situations when you're really receptive to the feedback and you received it well and you've learned something from it, you were very much curious with it. And that's the ultimate goal. Whenever feedback is coming our way, we want to shift away with our initial response, yes, but, to yes, tell me more. From this is wrong to tell me more, that's interesting. It's easier said than done, because there are times when we are very curious with the feedback. There are moments when we are not as receptive with the feedback. And of course, we want to be that receptive person, right? So how do we do that? I would always advise starting with yourself. And one of the best ways in which you can do that is, rather than practicing this skill in real time with people, how you receive that feedback, a really good idea here is to start with understanding and being more self-aware when you are receiving feedback via email, via text message perhaps, or when you read an article or read a post on social media that you disagree with, or there is an email that with a feedback that didn't really land with you. Those are your really good moments to start catching yourself in a moment and practicing. What are your thoughts? What is your initial response to the feedback? Because that's the crucial moment. I've mentioned that the goal is to be curious. You see, how curious we are, or how we are deflecting the feedback really starts with our initial response to it. So if you go back in your mind to the situations when you overreacted to the feedback, you'll find out that one of your first response was very much focused on anything but learning. So start practicing, catching yourself in real time when you're receiving feedback. What are your thoughts? If you were, here's the exercise, here's a way to think about it. If you were to transcript your initial thoughts when you're receiving feedback, and you then read through it, would the language be the language that would more likely help you learn more, or it would diminish your self-esteem, your self-worth, or someone else's self-esteem and worth? What is the language that you're using with yourself as you are receiving the feedback? Is this language and the story that you're telling yourself is more focused on the past and what has happened in the past and finding the reasons why it happened in terms of deflecting it? Or the ratio is better and more favorable towards future action-based? So rather than dwelling on what went wrong and looking for reasons and excuses and so on and so forth, are you thinking more about what have I learned from it and what I need to do to improve? And the ratio is here important because we tend to spend a lot of time right at the beginning of our the process of receiving the feedback in quite a negative state, negative thoughts. And by the time we know, our emotional status and emotional response changes, the whole physiology changes, and we no longer as receptive, right? So that early stage is really, really important. The way I like to look at it, in fact, the whole art of navigating through feedback conversation is all about directing the spotlight. Because whether you do it consciously or not, whether you're planning it or not, in each feedback conversation, whether you're the person who provides it or the person on the receiving end, you're always shining a spotlight on something. And that becomes the main point of focus. So if you look at it from the receiving end, here is the question for you. If you want to improve your receiving skills, receiving feedback skills, think about it that way. When you get the feedback, are you overly focused on deflect, on looking for the mitigating circumstances, excuses, or are you looking at finding not the reasons, but are you focusing on the other person intention or credibility? So the example of that would be when you receive the feedback and one of your first thoughts and sentences is that you're not being fair with me or you're picking up on me. What you're doing is you're discrediting the person, okay? Or you could discredit the person's ability. So the person who's sharing feedback with you has not really mastered a particular skill set, or they're making a similar mistake elsewhere, or you remember when they've also made a similar mistake elsewhere. Are you focusing on the feedback itself and learning from it? Or your thoughts are, well, you're not doing it yourself very well. Why would you challenge me? Of course, we don't want those thoughts, but this is a very typical way of responding to feedback. So is the spotlight going on discrediting the person's ability or intention? Are you shining the spotlight on looking for mitigating circumstances, aka excuses, why you haven't done it? Or the spotlight is on discrediting the feedback itself? That's wrong. That statement is not true. Because the more time you're spending on discrediting the feedback, discrediting the person, or looking for excuses, the further you are from being curious. And then it's really difficult to bring yourself back into that curious state and listen. If it's a real-time conversation, we have to take into account that the longer we are shining that spotlight on the person or the circumstances, their emotional state is also being altered. And now on both sides, emotions are rising. I've been criticized. I haven't received it really well. I don't feel like to receive it well. And now I need to defend myself. And now my tone of voice, what I'm saying, how I'm responding, my body language is different. The other person can sense it. And now both of us, the emotions are raising. If you are receiving the feedback via the email, the same thing happens. The only difference here is you are with yourself. Your own emotional status changes. Now, the rest of your day or part of your day is being altered because of that, or you are quickly going to email that person back whilst you're in that strongly emotionally charged state. Okay, so here's the practice. Walk away, and every piece of feedback that you receive, or you hear the opinion that you disagree with, or it's different to yours, try to find out and see, I'm really curious with, where is your spotlight going? Discrediting the feedback itself. And so the language is something along those lines. This is wrong. That's not right. This is not what happened. How about this? Or you shining that spotlight on the person itself, and you're questioning, challenging that person, either intention, i.e. you're not being fair with me, you're always picking up on me, you're not with me, you're against me, or the ability, the credibility of that person, right? And so when the thoughts are not focused on the learning from it and not curious, we are literally robbing ourselves from the opportunity to grow and improve, because we are consumed with deflecting the feedback, with deflecting the value and finding different reasons. With the practice, we want our default to be a curious state, receptive state. Hey, that's interesting, tell me more. Even when the feedback is really tough and difficult. So practice it on social media, on internet, at home, when you're receiving the emails, when you're having conversations with your friends and family and your colleagues as well. But what I'm saying here is, don't just limit yourself with practicing only during feedback conversation at work. There are a lot more opportunities to practice that particular skill. Now, here's another thing to be mindful and understand when it comes to receiving that feedback. Feedback, unfortunately, quite often is being shared with us as a label, meaning it's just a final conclusion, or just a final sort of a short note about what the feedback really is all about. So you may hear something like that: you are not good at doing this, you haven't done a good job here. It's very much just one or two sentences right at the end. It's just a label, and it doesn't really hold that much value. Now, the person on the providing it, of course, they have their own responsibility to learn and improve how to provide the feedback. But that doesn't mean we just have to stay with that label itself and focus on that label only. Because number one, there is not much value with that. And number two, it now changes what we think about the feedback. And here's the important part. Because the label lacks context, and we need to have the context, the story can't be just halfway told, we are going to add the context to the feedback ourselves. And typically, we have this tendency to assume the negative thing and to add a negative connotation, negative story to everything that is coming our way, especially when the feedback is challenging. So like I said earlier on about spotlights that we're shining on, when the feedback, when the label just comes in and lacks of that context, we're going to build more context around it. And it's more likely going to be that negative one. So your responsibility in that case is to help the other person to share that context. Remember, there is a lot more to the feedback than you just hear. And we have to understand that a lot of feedback is being shared with us with the good intention. It's just not being delivered that well, or we think it's not being delivered that way. It's quite complex, because we have to take into consideration not just what's being said, but how it's being said, at what point, where I am today with my own emotional state. What was my day like? What's your day like? Everything just accumulates and boils down into a feedback conversation. There's a lot more to it than just, hey, here's what I'm saying, here's what it means. Take it and leave it and do your best to learn from it. Relying just on being non-responsible, relying just on being professional it's not enough to do feedback conversations, right? So when you get that label, when the feedback is quite short, dig deeper, find and evaluate the context. Think about it that way. It's like canned with the soup. What you're receiving is just the label, but that label has no nutrition values. There is no value within that. The real value is the soup itself, and the soup is the context. If there is a lack of context, don't add it yourself to it, because more likely it's going to be that negative one. Find it, stay curious, ask questions. Try to learn what that person really meant. Why did they share their feedback? And so if you find yourself questioning their intention, for instance, it's a good time to recognize it in real time. And as I mentioned earlier on, how to practice it and staying a little bit curious and asking what made you say that? What led you to this conclusion? Or could you elaborate? Just have a conversation rather than take it in the face value. Because here's the thing, here's the tendency that we also have. When we hear feedback, especially when it's that challenging, the negative one, what we tend to do is we tend to confuse it, and we think that the feedback is about our identity and who we are as a person. If feedback, majority of the time, feedback is about a short period of the time, a one circumstances, a one instance of your performance or behavior in time. It is not the full evaluation of who you are as a human being. And unfortunately, somewhere in this conversation, what the person says and how we receive it, we quickly translate it, and it feels like, it seems to us like the feedback is about us as a whole, that the feedback is about our identity and who we are. And because it's in contradiction to what we want to be, who we want to be, and how we see ourselves, our emotional raise up, and there is no other choice but to defend ourselves. So when that label comes in, find the context behind it before you are taking this feedback as an evaluation of you as a person, and you take it on the face value. So it's really important. And the sooner you can do that in the feedback conversation, during the conversation, the better for you. Because the longer you stay with questioning the person's intention and why they do what they do and trying to find different reasons and deflecting that responsibility, the more difficult it is to bring yourself back into this curious and open state and ask those questions and learn and extract the value from the feedback itself. Like I mentioned right at the beginning, just because the feedback isn't delivered well doesn't mean that there is no value in it. It just means it's often hidden behind our emotional response to it. And so for you to grow, to take your career to the next level, to step up, to reach your own goals, not necessarily only those professional goals, because your goals could be the best possible partner in the world. And that's a wonderful goal to have. But what we need to do is to work towards it, meaning we need to seek the feedback and receive it well when it happens, and it tends to happen quite rarely, and extract the value so we can really improve. I don't see many more questions, guys, here in the chat. Maybe the chat is not linking. I know the Facebook often tends to do that for me. I don't receive all the comments from the Facebook. I do receive more from a LinkedIn itself. Nothing on the Instagram, guys. So you got some questions, please feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to give my best shot at answering. Let me just check my notes if I missed something that I want to talk about today. Oh, there is one more advice over there that I've just missed. Another good idea to do, something to practice for yourself if you want to improve your skills around receiving feedback well, is to detach yourself from this feedback and put yourself in a position that somebody around you, whether your friend or your partner, somebody who you really like and taking care of, over-responded to that feedback. What would you say to them? How would you elaborate that feedback for them? What would you advise them? Because there is this weird and strange relationship and tendency that we have. We tend to bash ourselves a lot, being very harsh on ourselves and really going hard on whatever we have achieved or haven't achieved. But we're not using the same language towards others, which is quite strange. Because taking care of ourselves, it should be our priority. But when we make that mistake, when something goes wrong, the story that we are telling ourselves is quite harsh, challenging. So take yourself away from it and use a different point of view and ask yourself, if someone else, if my friend would respond to the feedback in the same way, what would I advise them? Where would I direct them towards and want to think them about? And then apply the same thing for yourself. I already spoke about the shining the spotlight and whether you are discrediting the feedback itself, the person, or looking for the circumstances. Here's what I've learned with my own example. When I went through the feedback that I have received at some point, it was about a year ago or so, and it was this most crushing feedback that I have received in years, for that matter. And I consider myself a feedback savvy and growth savvy person, and I always find the value within it. But every now and then, I still have the emotional response to it. And there was this one particular feedback that I received via the email. It was an important event that I did. And one particular person shared a certain feedback with me that didn't resonate with me. In fact, it triggered me tremendously. I was stressed, I was overwhelmed, I was panicking, I was questioning myself for the first few minutes. But when I slowed down, what I've realized is that my initial response to that feedback, to every line of the feedback that a person shared with me, I started with, what do you mean? So find your own a go-to response, if you will. What is your tendency to respond to the feedback? When you hear the feedback, the challenging one, or you get that email that you don't really agree with, are you also asking yourself a question? What do you mean I haven't done that? What do you mean I should do this and I haven't done that? Or perhaps you have your own phrase, a catchphrase that you use. Identify it. Because when you identify it and you're really mindful that this indicates and signals that you're about to deflect the feedback, that you're about moving away from that curious state, then you are giving yourself a better chance to realize it in the real time when it happens and snap yourself away from going that downward spiral, from diminishing the relationship between you and another person. Because like I mentioned right at the beginning of the session, it's not only about how we receive feedback and how we grow or not. It's not just on how we feel in a moment and our own emotional well-being. It's also that, but there's also this relationship factor. And if you over-respond to the feedback, something happens in the relationship between me and you. That trust is being slightly diminished. And what you want as a leader is to build more trust. And last week I spoke about the jar of trust, the metaphor that Brene Brown is using. And imagine yourself, you holding this jar with marbles. And each act of kindness and each time that somebody perceives you as a good person, you've done something with a good intention and see that way, you add one marble. If you screw it up, sometimes even a whole handful of marbles is going away. And so if your employee is brave enough, is courageous enough to share the feedback with you and you over-respond to it, the whole handful of marble is moving away from this jar. Now the relationship between you and employee is being a little bit damaged, and you're going to have to work to fix it, which has a huge influence on how you navigate in sort of a team setting. But also it makes a future feedback conversation a lot more difficult, because the lesser the marbles in the jar is, the more likely the next feedback conversation you will have with that person, whether you're sharing it or receiving it, will start with them being in that defensive state, cautious, rather than being open with it. So if you're sharing feedback to them, they will be a lot more defensive from the get-go, because they will remember the last time you haven't really responded well to that feedback. So it's really important for your career, for your emotional well-being, and for the relationship with people around you when you're working on receiving feedback well. I think that's all that I wanted to cover on this session, plus answering your questions. If you're watching this video as a replay and you've got some questions, shoot me them over. I'm more than happy to answer and expand on it next week or the next sessions. Or perhaps next time around when I come back to receiving feedback, I can then elaborate a little bit more. So I hope, guys, that you found this session helpful. I hope that I've answered certain of your questions and concerns around receiving feedback. And I've convinced you a little bit more to spend a little bit more time on your ability to receiving that feedback well. It's really, really important, guys. Last thing, what's happening a week coming, guys? Tomorrow, a huge interview with Derek Gaunt about treating your employees as hostage takers. Now, Derek wrote a phenomenal book about that, and he spent decades as a hostage negotiator. And there is a lot more, so much I can learn from these tactics that hostage negotiators are using. And tomorrow I'll be having this conversation with Derek, and specifically I'll be drilling down into feedback conversations. How can we learn from his experience and approach, and what we can learn within a feedback conversation or during a difficult conversations with those around us. So that is happening tomorrow, 7 p.m. GMT. And as always, next Sunday, another feedback Q&A. I haven't picked up the topic just yet, guys, so I'll decide the next few days. If you have an idea, what would you like me to discuss next week mainly? Again, message me, let me know, and I'll make it happen. And last but not least, on the 16th of February, I'm holding a bite-sized workshop on positive feedback, open workshop for everyone else. It's £30 per person, 2 hours workshop, really, really good one. You will learn how to use positive feedback to boost your employee morale, to recognize your team, but also how to use it as a coaching tool. Because positive feedback, when you use it in the right way, it's a really powerful coaching tool. So that's 16th of February, guys. Meanwhile, I wish you all the best. Have a great day on purpose, and see you next week.